Dr. Ethan Cole had seen many strange things in his life, but nothing like this. His clinic on Valeth was usually quiet. It was a small medical station, built for humans and a few other species who passed through the neutral trading planet. Ethan had worked here for years, helping travelers, diplomats, and sometimes even criminals, but never had a group of heavily armed alien warriors stormed into his clinic, carrying what looked like a dying princess. The Velari were a proud and powerful race, known for their advanced technology and strict traditions. Their golden skin, sharp eyes, and tall frames made them stand out among other species. They rarely asked for help, especially not from a human. But tonight was different. The warriors, dressed in dark armor, rushed inside. One of them, taller than the rest, stepped forward and spoke in a deep, commanding voice. "She is dying. Save her." Ethan barely had time to react before they placed her on his operating table. The princess, he could tell by the intricate golden markings on her forehead, was unconscious. Her breathing was weak. Blood, a deep shade of violet, stained her royal robes. There was a deep wound near her ribs, and her body trembled slightly as if she was fighting to stay alive. "What happened to her?" Ethan asked, already scanning her injuries. "A coward's attack," the warrior growled. "A hidden blade. Poisoned." Ethan's stomach tightened. Poison. That explained why her body wasn't healing. The Velari had strong regenerative abilities, but poison could block that natural process. He didn't know what kind of toxin it was, but he didn't have time to figure it out. She needed immediate treatment. "I need space," Ethan said firmly. And silence. The warriors hesitated. They didn't trust him. He could see it in their eyes. But their leader gave a sharp nod, and they stepped back, standing against the walls like silent statues. Ethan took a deep breath and got to work. His hands moved quickly. He cut away the blood-soaked fabric and examined the wound. The blade had gone deep, dangerously close to her vital organs. He needed to remove the poison first. Most alien doctors would have relied on technology, but Ethan knew that wouldn't work here. The poison was already spreading, and every second counted. Instead, he did what humans did best. He adapted. He used a combination of old-school human medical techniques and advanced tools to carefully extract the infected tissue. The machines beeped softly, tracking her weak heartbeat. Sweat formed on Ethan's forehead as he worked. He injected a stabilizing agent, hoping it would slow the poison spread. Minutes passed, then an hour. The warriors watched in silence. He could feel their piercing gazes, full of doubt and fear. He ignored them. His only focus was the princess. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ethan finished. The poison was out. The wound was closed. He adjusted the medical scanner and checked her vitals. Her heartbeat was steady now. Her breathing was stronger. She would live. Ethan exhaled, stepping back. "She's stable," he said, "but she needs rest." The leader of the warriors stepped forward, looking at the unconscious princess. For the first time, Ethan saw something in the warrior's eyes. Relief. "You have done what we could not," he said quietly. Ethan wiped his hands on a cloth, his muscles aching from exhaustion. "That's my job." The warrior studied him for a long moment, then gave a sharp nod. "The king must hear of this." Ethan frowned. "The king?" "You saved Princess Xyra's life," the warrior said. "By Velari law, this cannot go unrewarded." Ethan sighed. He wasn't looking for rewards. He had just done what any doctor would do, but something told him this was far from over. As he looked at the sleeping princess, he had no idea that his life was about to change forever. The clinic was silent except for the steady beeping of the medical scanner. Dr. Ethan Cole sat beside the unconscious princess, watching the readings on the monitor. Her heartbeat was strong now, her breathing smooth. The worst was over, but she was still weak, and it would take time for her body to fully recover. Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. He had worked for hours, pushing himself to the limit. He wasn't sure if it was skill, luck, or pure stubbornness that had saved her, but somehow he had done it. The Vailari warriors had not left. They stood in the shadows, unmoving, their golden eyes fixed on their princess. The leader, the tallest of them, had been watching Ethan closely. "What?" Ethan finally asked, breaking the silence. The warrior took a step forward. "You are unlike other humans." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Because I'm a doctor." The warrior nodded. "Most humans we have met are traders, explorers, or soldiers. But you saved the heir to our throne when even our own healers could not." Ethan shrugged. "Medicine is about knowledge and adaptability. Vailari technology is advanced, but it's not perfect. Your people rely too much on machines. Sometimes the old ways work best." The warrior considered his words. "And yet you risked much. If she had died under your hands, you would not have left this place alive." Ethan sighed. "Good to know." He turned his attention back to the princess. She was still asleep, but her fingers twitched slightly, a sign that she was waking up. Moments later, her eyes fluttered open. At first, Syra saw nothing but a blur of light. Her head felt heavy, her body weak. She tried to move, but pain shot through her side. A voice, calm and steady, spoke beside her. "Don't move too much. You're still healing." She turned her head slightly, her vision clearing. A man sat beside her. A human. Dark-haired, weary-eyed, dressed in simple medical scrubs. Not what she had expected. Her gaze flicked to the warriors standing behind him. They were tense, alert. That meant she was still in danger. But the human did not look like a threat. If anything, he looked tired. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Dr. Ethan Cole," he said. "I'm the one who saved your life." Zyra frowned. A human had saved her. That was impossible. The Vailari were superior in every way, or so she had always been taught. Their healers had the most advanced technology in the galaxy. And yet she was still alive because of this man. "How?" she whispered. Ethan leaned back, arms crossed. "I cut out the poison. Stitched you up the old-fashioned way." She didn't understand his words completely, but she could hear the truth in his voice. He had done something no Vailari healer could. Zetera glanced down at her side, touching the bandages. "You risked much for me." Ethan shrugged. "It's my job." A strange silence filled the room. The warriors stood stiffly, waiting for her reaction. Even Ethan seemed uncertain about what would happen next. Finally, the leader of the warriors stepped forward. "Princess Zyra, you live because of this human." Zyra met Ethan's gaze. His eyes were steady, unafraid. He had no idea what he had done. No idea of the ancient law he had now become a part of. She took a slow breath. "Then by our traditions, he must be rewarded." Ethan sighed. "Look, if you're offering money, I don't." The warrior cut him off. "Not money. Something far greater." Ethan frowned. "What are you talking about?" Zyra hesitated. She knew what was coming, but she also knew Ethan was not prepared for it. "The king will decide," she said finally. "But there is only one reward for saving a royal life." Ethan looked between her and the warriors. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of something bigger than himself. And for the first time that night, he realized his problems were only just beginning. Ethan sat in the corner of his clinic, sipping a cup of cold coffee. He barely had time to rest before the Vailari warriors came to him again. This time, their message was clear. King Valos himself had summoned him. Ethan had never met a Vailari king before. He had heard stories, of course. King Valos was a ruler feared and respected across the galaxy. The Vailari were a proud and powerful race, and their king was the strongest among them. The fact that Ethan had saved his daughter's life made things complicated. Zyra was still weak but recovering quickly. She was seated on a medical bed, her golden eyes watching him closely. There was something different in her gaze now. Less doubt, more curiosity. "You seem troubled," she said. Ethan sighed. "I don't like surprises. And this king of yours, he sounds like the type to have a lot of them." Zaira smiled slightly. "He will not harm you. You saved my life. That means something to my people." Ethan shook his head. "That's what I'm worried about." The doors of the clinic opened, and the warrior leader stepped inside. He nodded toward Ethan. "It is time." Ethan stood up, taking a deep breath. "Let's get this over with." The Valeri Palace was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. It was massive, built from dark stone, and glowing blue crystals that pulsed with energy. The air smelled of incense and burning metal, a mix of the old and the new. The warriors led him through grand halls filled with alien nobles in flowing robes. They whispered as he passed, their golden eyes studying him. Some looked impressed. Others looked annoyed. Finally, they reached the throne room. King Velos sat on a towering throne made of dark metal, carved with ancient symbols. He was larger than the other Valeri, his golden skin marked with battle scars. His eyes, sharp, calculating, locked onto Ethan the moment he entered. The room was silent. Ethan could feel the weight of every gaze on him. The king leaned forward. "You are the human doctor." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, that's me." A slow rumble of amusement came from the king's chest. "You do not bow." Ethan hesitated. "Is that required?" The room tensed. A few nobles looked shocked. But King Velos laughed. It was a deep, booming sound that echoed through the throne room. "You have courage," the king said. "Good." Ethan wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a warning. The king's gaze darkened slightly. "You saved my daughter's life. That is a great thing. And in our culture, great things must be rewarded." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I don't need a reward. I was just doing my job." The nobles murmured. The idea of refusing a royal gift was unheard of. King Velos raised a hand, silencing them. "You misunderstand, human. This is not a choice." Ethan frowned. "Then what exactly is my reward?" The king stood, his presence filling the room. "By our laws, a life saved is a life bound. You saved my daughter. That means you are now part of the royal bloodline." Ethan blinked. "Wait. What?" The king's voice was firm. "You will marry Princess Syra." The words hit Ethan like a shockwave. The room was silent, every noble watching his reaction. Ethan glanced at Syra, but she looked calm, as if she had expected this. "You can't be serious," Ethan said, looking back at the king. Velos' expression didn't change. "This is the way of my people. A royal life saved cannot be left in debt. You saved my daughter, so now you must be bound to her." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "Okay, listen. I respect your traditions, but I'm not Valeri. I'm just a doctor. I don't belong in a palace, and I definitely don't belong in a royal marriage." One of the nobles stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Refusing the king's gift is an insult." Ethan looked around. He could feel the tension rising. Zaira finally spoke. "Father, perhaps we should consider his position." The king's gaze softened slightly as he looked at his daughter. "You do not wish for this." Zaira hesitated. "It is not about what I want. It is about what is right. Forcing the union does not make it strong." Velos studied Ethan again. His expression was unreadable. Then he stepped forward and placed a heavy hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You are different from the others," the king said. "That is why you must stay." Ethan frowned. "Stay?" Velos nodded. "You may not accept the marriage now, but you will remain in this palace until you understand the meaning of your actions." Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but he saw something in the king's eyes. Finality. There was no escaping this. His life had just become far more complicated than he ever imagined. Ethan sat on the balcony of his new quarters, staring at the twin moons in the Valeri sky. The air was warm, carrying the scent of strange flowers and distant ocean waves. The palace was beautiful, but to him, it felt more like a cage. 3 days had passed since the king's announcement. 3 days of confusion, frustration, and unanswered questions. He was not allowed to leave the palace. He was not under guard, but the message was clear. He was expected to stay. Ethan sighed and leaned back in his chair. He had no idea what to do. He had come to this planet as a doctor, not a royal guest, or worse, a political prisoner. The door to his room opened. Princess Xyra stepped inside. She wore a deep blue gown with golden embroidery, her royal markings glowing faintly in the dim light. Her expression was unreadable. "You look troubled," she said. Ethan let out a small laugh. "That's one way to put it. I saved your life, and now I'm trapped in a palace, being told I have to marry a princess." He shook his head. "Not exactly what I signed up for." Xyra sat across from him, folding her hands in her lap. "I understand your frustration, but you must realize, my father is a man of tradition. He does not change his mind easily." Ethan sighed. "There has to be a way out of this." She hesitated before answering. "There might be, but it will not be easy." Ethan leaned forward. "I'm listening." Xyra glanced toward the balcony, as if checking for eavesdroppers. Then she lowered her voice. "My father is not an unfair ruler. He values strength, honor, and loyalty. If you can prove yourself in another way, something equal to the bond of marriage, he may reconsider." Ethan frowned. "And how do I do that?" Xyra hesitated. "There is an ancient trial, a challenge that only the strongest warriors of our people attempt. If you survive it, you may earn the right to refuse the marriage." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess, no human has ever done it before." Xyra gave a small smile. "No." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "Of course not." The next morning, Ethan stood before King Velos in the throne room. The nobles had gathered, watching in anticipation. The tension in the air was thick. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Your Majesty, I understand the honor you offer me, but I believe I should have the right to prove myself in another way." The king's golden eyes narrowed. "And how do you wish to prove yourself, human?" Ethan stood tall. "I wish to take the trial of the worthy." Gasps filled the room. Whispers spread among the nobles like wildfire. Even the warriors looked surprised. King Velos studied Ethan carefully. Then, a slow smile spread across his face. "You are bold," the king said. "Very well. You shall take the trial." Ethan exhaled, relieved. But then the king's expression darkened. "Understand this, human," Velos continued. "No outsider has ever attempted this trial. It is a test of strength, intelligence, and courage. If you fail, you will not only lose your chance to refuse the marriage." The king's gaze was like steel. "You will lose your life." Silence fell over the room. Ethan swallowed hard. He had expected danger, but hearing it from the king himself made it real. Still, he met the king's gaze without fear. "I understand." Velos nodded. "Then prepare yourself, human. At dawn, your trial begins." As Ethan turned to leave, he caught Xyra's eyes. There was something in them. Concern, maybe even regret. For the first time, she wasn't sure if he would survive. The sun had barely risen when Ethan stood at the entrance of the trial grounds. The arena stretched before him, a vast landscape of jagged rocks, deep pits, and ancient ruins covered in glowing alien vines. Strange creatures moved in the shadows, their eyes reflecting the morning light. Ethan took a deep breath. This was it, his only chance to prove himself and earn his freedom. A loud horn echoed through the valley. The trial had begun. King Velos and the royal court watched from a high platform, their golden eyes fixed on Ethan. Xyra stood beside her father, her face unreadable. She had warned him of the dangers, but now it was up to him. A warrior stepped forward, holding a ceremonial spear. "The trial of the worthy has 3 challenges," he announced. "Survive them, and you may claim your right to refuse the royal bond." Fail, and you will not leave this place alive. Ethan nodded. No pressure, huh? The warrior ignored his words. Your first challenge. The hunt. A deep growl rumbled through the air. From the far end of the arena, a massive beast emerged. It had 6 legs, razor-sharp claws, and glowing blue scales that shimmered in the sunlight. Its fangs dripped with venom, and its yellow eyes locked onto Ethan with hunger. Ethan clenched his fists. He had no weapons, no armor, only his wits. The beast roared and charged. Ethan barely had time to react before it swiped at him. He dove to the side, rolling across the ground. Dust filled his lungs as he scrambled to his feet. Okay, he muttered. Let's see how tough you really are. The creature lunged again. This time, Ethan ran toward the ruins, jumping over broken stone pillars. The beast followed, smashing through obstacles with ease. Ethan knew he couldn't outrun it forever. He needed a plan. His eyes darted around, searching for anything useful. That's when he spotted it, a rusted metal spear sticking out of the ground. It looked ancient, but it would have to do. He sprinted toward it, but the beast was faster. It pounced, knocking him to the ground. Claws raked across his shoulder, pain exploding through his body. Gritting his teeth, Ethan kicked the creature in the face and rolled away. Blood dripped from his arm, but he ignored it. He grabbed the spear and turned just in time to see the beast charging again. Ethan planted his feet, gripping the weapon tightly. He waited. Then, at the last second, he leaped to the side and drove the spear into the beast's neck. The creature let out a terrible screech, its body thrashing violently. Ethan held on. Pushing the weapon deeper, the beast collapsed with a final, shuddering breath. Silence filled the arena. Then the sound of the horn rang again. The first challenge was complete. Ethan staggered to his feet, his shoulder burning. He looked up at the royal platform. The nobles whispered among themselves, surprised. Even King Velos seemed mildly impressed. Zyra, however, looked concerned. The warrior stepped forward once more. The second challenge. The ascent. Ethan turned to see a towering wall of jagged rocks, stretching high into the sky. At the very top, a glowing crystal floated inside a stone altar. Retrieve the crystal, the warrior said. Only then will you proceed. Ethan sighed. Great, climbing while bleeding. Just what I needed. Ignoring the pain, he approached the rock wall and began his ascent. His fingers gripped the rough stone, his muscles straining with each movement. Halfway up, the wind grew stronger, howling through the cliffs. Loose rocks crumbled beneath his hands, forcing him to be extra careful. One wrong step, and he'd fall to his death. Higher and higher he climbed, sweat dripping down his face. His wounded shoulder throbbed, but he pushed through. Finally, after what felt like hours, he reached the top. The crystal pulsed with energy, casting a soft blue light over the altar. Ethan grabbed it, holding it up for all to see. The horn sounded again. The second challenge was complete. By the time Ethan climbed back down, his body was exhausted, but he had no time to rest. The warrior stepped forward one last time. The final challenge. The reckoning. Ethan frowned. That doesn't sound good. The ground trembled. Across the arena, a massive stone door opened, revealing a Velarri warrior clad in golden armor. He was taller, stronger, and carried a blade that gleamed in the sunlight. Ethan's stomach sank. This is Kordak, the undefeated champion, the warrior announced. Defeat him, or fall. Kordak stepped forward, his gaze cold and merciless. Ethan took a shaky breath. He had survived a beast. He had climbed a mountain. But now, he had to fight a warrior unlike any he had ever faced. He clenched his fists. He wasn't done yet. Ethan stood in the center of the arena, breathing heavily. His body ached from the first 2 challenges, and his injured shoulder throbbed with pain. But now he faced the final trial, the one that would determine his fate. Across from him, Kordak, the undefeated Velari warrior, stepped forward. His golden armor gleamed under the twin suns, and his massive blade hummed with energy. He was taller, stronger, and clearly trained for battle. Ethan had no weapon, no armor, just his wits and determination. From the royal platform, King Velos watched with an unreadable expression. The nobles whispered among themselves, some expecting Ethan to surrender, others waiting for a quick defeat. Zyra, however, looked tense. She knew this was not a fair fight. Kordak raised his blade. "You are brave, human, but bravery is not enough." Ethan exhaled. "Yeah, I get that a lot." The warrior moved first, charging at him like a living battering ram. Ethan barely dodged, rolling to the side as the energy blade sliced through the air, leaving a sharp hum behind. The ground where he had stood was now a scorched mark. Ethan's heart pounded. One hit from that weapon, and it was over. Kordak turned quickly, faster than Ethan expected. He swung his blade again, forcing Ethan to duck and scramble backward. The crowd cheered as the warrior pressed the attack, each strike coming closer and closer. Ethan knew he couldn't win in a contest of strength, but he wasn't here to fight like a warrior. He was here to fight like a survivor. He noticed Kordak's pattern. The warrior was fast but predictable. His attacks were powerful but required momentum. Ethan waited, watched, and then, at the last second, he dived forward, slipping past Kordak's side. The warrior's blade slammed into the ground, stuck for a brief moment. That was Ethan's chance. With all his strength, he kicked Kordak's knee from behind. The warrior stumbled, his balance thrown off. Ethan didn't stop. He grabbed a handful of sand and threw it directly into Kordak's face. The warrior growled, momentarily blinded. The crowd gasped. Some nobles muttered in anger. This was not the way of honorable combat. But Ethan wasn't here for honor. He was here to survive. With Kordak distracted, Ethan sprinted toward the fallen blade. It was massive, nearly as long as his body, but he lifted it with both hands. His arms shook under its weight, but he held firm. Kordak blinked away the sand, his vision clearing just as Ethan charged forward. The warrior barely had time to react before Ethan swung the blade, hitting him in the chest with the blunt side of the weapon. The impact sent Kordak crashing to the ground. Silence filled the arena. Ethan stood over the fallen warrior, panting. His muscles burned, and his vision blurred with exhaustion. Kordak groaned, attempting to rise, but Ethan placed the blade against his neck. Not to kill, but to prove a point. The horn sounded. The trial was over. The nobles erupted into murmurs. No outsider had ever won the trial of the worthy. Some were impressed, others outraged. King Velos stood from his throne, his golden eyes locked onto Ethan. Then, to everyone's surprise, he laughed, a deep, booming sound. "You fight like no warrior I have seen before," the king said. "You do not follow our traditions. You do not fight with strength, but with intelligence." Ethan exhaled. "I'll take that as a compliment." Velos nodded. "You have earned your right. The bond of marriage is no longer required. You are free." The nobles gasped again. No one had expected the king to release Ethan so easily. Ethan's body sagged with relief. It was over. He had done it. He looked up at Zyra, who was watching him closely. For the first time, he saw something in her eyes, something he couldn't quite describe. Admiration, respect, maybe something more. Kordak stood, rubbing his head. Instead of anger, he gave Ethan a small nod. "You are a worthy opponent, human." Ethan grinned. "Thanks, but let's not do that again." The king raised his hand, silencing the crowd. "Ethan Walker, you have proven yourself in the eyes of the Velari people. You are no longer just a doctor. You are an honored guest of the royal house." The words sent another wave of murmurs through the nobles. Ethan wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. Velos smiled. "Rest, human, for your story is not yet finished." Ethan sighed. He had won his freedom, But somehow he had a feeling his adventure was far from over.